In our last lecture, we looked at the innovative policymaker. In this lecture, we turn our attention to the professional. We can often focus examining different segments of the workforce. In this lecture, we have chosen to focus on a narrow range of occupations traditionally located at the upper end of most prestige rankings, the professional job. Professional jobs are worthy of examination in their own right for three important reasons, and notably in the context of government. First, professional jobs are the focus of the aspiration of most university-educated young persons. Studies show that most Canadians who go to university generally want a professional job. Second, professional jobs represent a segment of the labor market that is usually defined as desirable by larger segments of Canadian society. And third, professional jobs have experienced changes that are both similar to and different from changes experienced by other occupational groups as a result of globalization of the Canadian economy. Professional jobs have been at the heart and soul of middle-class advancement in Canada, especially since World War II, and notably for students who are first generation of families, within their families that is, to attend university. However, many observers now say that the prerogatives and prestige that used to follow automatically with professional jobs are no longer assured. Higher salaries, interesting work, higher levels of job autonomy and job security that were once taken for granted upon making it to an elite white-collar job is no longer necessarily the reality. In this lecture, we are going to understand how these changes have occurred and what it means for government workers who are professionals. Moreover, the lecture is going to examine current working arrangements in government for professionals. Traditional professional working arrangements are being abandoned, and new arrangements for the delivery of professional service is being attempted. And as we will see, this is occurring at a much more hyper pace in a COVID and post-COVID environment. But first, it is worthwhile to understand what it means to be a professional. A professional can be used as a concept to signify prestige, respect, and to perform some task with great skill or proficiency. It can be used as a concept to study elite classes of occupations with a focus on the characteristics or attributes of such occupations as a taxonomy, that is, an attributed model of professions, or a process model to study the process through which certain occupations come to acquire power, develop monopolies, and or to lay claim to the status of a profession. At first glance, you would think that there would be a precise definition of professional work. And in fact, when we discuss Taylorism and we discuss Weberianism, they were, for the most part, discussing the professional worker. And so we expect the professional, albeit the doctor, the lawyer, the accountant, to engage in certain types of behaviors as their clients or patients. The qualities that we expect most of professionals include some evidence of certification, objectivity, disinterestedness, adherence to a set of professional ethics, and a service orientation. Again, it echoes along the lines of the Weberian and Tayloristic sort of idea. We expect professionals to put our interests first, to engage in maximum efforts on our behalf, and to be competent in carrying out their task. In exchange for these expectations, we customarily grant professionals wide leeway to do their work. In exchange for a deference to their expertise, we expect the professional to use their professional authority in our best interests. When we look at the development of the professional, we can trace back many centuries the early development of professions, and in particular in medicine, law, and divinity. One notable contextual factor, which may be seen to have some relevance in this respect, is early links with the established church, facilitating autonomy and social status, which has become key factors in the identification of professional activity. The modern status of professionals is perhaps based more firmly in the 19th century, where the links to the church are perhaps echoed in a sense of a Victorian responsibility with the rigid social hierarchies this involves. Clearly, this fertile breeding ground for the early professions produced a strong emphasis on social status. This social status was rooted in the notion of the gentlemanly conduct of those who were members of the group. This was seen to be a guarantee of the integrity of the professional, providing services to a public who were not knowledgeable purchasers. Indeed, some work on the early professional history of the accounting profession suggests that broader moral lapses, as much as lapses in professional competence, were at the root of the generation of a code of discipline. In general, institutional, scientific, and social development had direct impacts on key professions. For example, again, looking at law, accounting, medicine, or engineers. These ideas of profession still linger in our collective consciousness, but we should be aware of the ways in which they've been channeled by the 20th century. As implied, the evolution of professionalism in the 20th century cannot be understood without reference to key developments in the societal contextual tapestry that has occurred and which forms a backdrop for the particular changes. One such contextual factor which has perhaps affected professional development is the advent of scientific management, or Taylorism. We discussed scientific management in great deal in our earlier lectures, but essentially it was a philosophy of separating conception and execution of tasks, that is to say, differentiating thinking from doing. This is called a philosophy rather than a set of practices for two reasons. First, there's almost a universal defense from the doers from the developing union movement who worried about labor unrest. Hence, the control that Taylorism sought to impose was always contested. Second, it was never a universal practice. For example, it was highly appropriate in some sectors, but largely inappropriate in others. The basic difference between the two situations is that in one case, the knowledge necessary for thinking is separable from the doing, and in the other it's not. While Taylorism as a set of specific practices were never universal, it did inform management philosophy, that managers had a right to manage. In the early years of the 20th century, this right to manage only affected the working classes to a great extent. In effect, there's a distinction to be made between conception and execution, thinking and doing. Professionals were thinkers who were not subject to the managerial control of this dichotomy. Of course, as the century progressed, the ideology of the manager's right to manage has been consolidated to such an extent that this prerogative is now seen as appropriate to extend to professional activities. Another contextual factor which was important in developing professionalism was the development of the large-scale organization. This might be seen to have influenced the need for more systemic control of the workforce, but it also introduced the necessity of new specialist organization tasks, such as financial management, research and development. This is of interest for two reasons. First, it gave some established professions, particularly accounting and law, a new relevance. Second, it illustrates the complex socioeconomic context in which professional projects developed. A final contextual issue to be considered is the growth of the public sector, and in this respect we can consider the way in which the Keynes-Beveridge consensus in the United Kingdom linking economic and social welfare reforms were implemented. In the development of the welfare state, institutions which took up the organization of a number of professional services were born. In this process, the professional status and autonomy of existing and developing professional groups was embedded in hierarchically organized welfare services. It was in these bureaucracies that a different notion of professionalism developed from that of independent and ancient professions, for example, law and medicine, which has existed previously. The differences have resulted in a division between the private and public sector professionalism that is central to the development of professions. So I mentioned the term professional projects in the previous slides. It's worthwhile for us to discuss what a professional project is. A professional project are a set of activities that are oriented around the goal of making managerial jobs more professional in appearance and orientation. The activities of most professional projects are directed towards enhancing the legitimate domain of the occupation and defining their interests relative to potential competitors and overseers. Professionalization is the result of a professional project. An occupation is professionalized to the extent that it successfully defines a set of work tasks as their exclusive domain and successfully defends that domain against competing claims. Professionalism is a powerful cultural metaphor in most Western cultures and societies. But this set of expectations about interactions with professionals only defines the relationship between the professional and the client. They say very little about the relationship of professional to each other or the relationship between professions and other occupational groups. The use of the term professional project is designed to focus our attention on those sets of interactions, in addition to the interactions we may have with professionals, clients, and patients. Most professional projects attempt to enhance the autonomy and freedom of action for occupational incumbents under a set of well-defined professional norms. Moreover, they defend a specific task domain from encroachment by competing occupational groups or stakeholders. For example, during the 1980s, a number of nursing associations in various states sought to change legislation on the definition of a clinical nurse practice. These lobbying attempts focus on changing the legal definitions of what nurses were and were not allowed to do with and without physician supervision. Now, the problem with studying professional projects is that they usually are a product of collective volition. Professional groups know that they are defining, defending, and broadening their work domains. Each individual member may have a slightly different reason for participating and slightly different goals that they hope will come from these actions. But the organizations effectively exist to protect and expand the interests of professional occupations. Professionals who join these groups know this. Most discussions of professional projects have focused on the histories of well-established professions, so the physician or the lawyer, or occupational groups with professional aspirations that are not quite fully realized, such as a pharmacist. Having discussed the development of the professional, as well as outlining the tenets of the professional project, we now turn our attention to what the government workplace today is really characterized by. We will suggest there are 6 main points we can articulate looking at the transformation of professional work and what the government workplace today is characterized as. Foremost, there are flatter organizational hierarchies, as new information technologies eliminate the need for middle layers of management. Second, there's a growing use of temporary workers employed on an as-needed basis to perform specific jobs for the duration of single projects. Third, we can see there's an extensive use of subcontracting and outsourcing to external firms and or suppliers to produce products and services that were once provided by permanent in-house employees. Fourth, we can suggest there's been massive downsizing of the permanent workforce, as governments as an organization need fewer management and support people, and they replace skilled workers with either computer-skilled operators or unskilled machine tenders. A fifth characteristic of the transformation of professional work as it pertains to government is a post-unionized bargaining environment where unions have either no place or reduced power and have no structural ability to gain a foothold to bargain with employers. The last aspect we can articulate is that there are virtual organizations that exist as a web of technologically driven interactions rather than as a distinctive physical worksite that can be concretely located in geographical space. At the end of the day, professional work in government is being transformed by dynamics that are linking them in a complex web of connections that transform the functions of each. The workplace that results from this transformation is more collaborative, and electronically network. The downsizing, outsourcing, flattened organizational hierarchies, and networks of relationships that governments have been embedded in are moving towards, in many respects, we can say it's more of a collaborative professional practice setting. Most research on the relationship between professional employees assumes that professionals were controlling other professionals. Some have argued that control relationships have changed from informal and collegial relationships to formalized relationships that look like conventional managerial hierarchies. Now, the range of organizational settings where professionals work have moved away from models of solo practice, the partnership, group practice, or the modern bureaucratic organization. Professionals are found as salaried employees for for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, in government units of all sorts, in non-governmental organizations, universities, and corporations. In many of these work settings, the control of professional work no longer rests with peers or even the administrative elite of the profession. Instead, control over professional work is vested in managers of the employing organization. Some argue that the control of professional work by non-professional extends to decisions concerning compensation and to the evaluation of professional performance. In some cases, professional accountability has shifted as professional practice takes on a new organizational form. Ironically, the increasing diverse settings where professional work takes place is not translating into equally diverse mechanisms for controlling professionals on the job. Instead, these mechanisms seem to be converging on a common model. This result is predicted by institutional theories of organizations, a theory we looked at in our earlier lectures. Institutional isomorphism is a process of social change that moves groups of organizations towards similar practices and structure over time as they compete for political power and legitimacy. There are three mechanisms that produce isomorphism: coercive pressures from governing bodies or the state, mimemic pressures to copy existing practices that other organizations have used successfully, and normative pressures from powerful professional groups within organizations. One can aptly see the power of normative pressures in the traditional organization of professions. The questioning of professional practices will open up avenues for a new professionalism, one that blends control through expertise with an openness to inspection and evaluation by peers and the public at large. We can suggest that such a model will be possible at present or in the near future. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that control over professional work is moving firmly in the direction of corporate and bureaucratic control. Professional practice in many sectors is driven by pressure for revenue generation, accountability. We see these examples of this shift in almost every professional practice setting. In many ways, these changes in control structures reflect changes in the impact of external threats to professional autonomy. Changes in professional practice settings almost naturally lead to questions about how to maintain the unity of interests among professionals themselves. If organizational arrangements are splintering, one could reasonably expect the interests of professionals in widely differing work settings to diverge as well. The debates about these changes are often couched in terms of professionalization, de-professionalization, and in some cases proletarianization. So we have seen that professionalization is a byproduct of a successful professional project. An occupation is professionalized to the extent that it succeeds in defining a set of work tasks as their exclusive domain and successfully defending that domain against competing occupations and oversight by clients and outside interests. De-professionalization is a process whereby the professional prerogatives of an occupation have been eroded. A profession starts to lose control over its task domain, and professional work begins to look like conventional white-collar work with a complex hierarchical structure and an elaborate system of accountability. Proletarianization refers to the loss of earnings, power, and prestige that accompany the loss of professional prerogatives. Instead of a reorganized profession with a reduced set of professional prerogatives, proletarianized professionals work in contexts where none of these prerogatives remain, and the context, control, and location of work is done by outsiders. Debates about professionalization and de-professionalization often fail to separate the content of professional work from the context where the work is performed. These concepts can give you the false impression that professions revert to organizational forms found at earlier times in history. But social change rarely runs in reverse. Instead, professional work is moving in new directions that are distinct departures from traditional professional life or the pre-professional history of most occupations. Further, the relationship between diversification of professional interests and de-professionalization is not well specified. Why would we expect diversification of professional interests to harm professional projects? What evidence is there that professional interests have diversified in response to recent changes in professional practice settings? Evidence for the diversification of professional interests is fragmentary at best. Researchers usually point to the growing racial, ethnic, and gender diversity of recent cohorts as a sign of the diversification of professional interests. Other research points to well-publicized disputes within professional associations or challenges to their governance of the profession. Relatively little research asks professionals from different backgrounds working in different organizational contexts what they view as the nature of their professional role or how they view their professional roles. Evidence regarding the effects of cost containment on professional divisiveness is relatively fragmentary as well. In theory, uniform pressures for cost containment should produce relatively uniform responses that mitigate the effects of diversified professional interests on professional practice. However, there's relatively little research on the effects of cost containment on the context and context of professional work. This concludes our lecture on the professional. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at the ethnic minority in government.